Master, give the blessing. Is done.
What you are about to listen to is a podcast produced by Philokalia Ministries. Philokalia Ministries is offered to all free of charge. However, there are real and immediate needs associated with it. If you are a regular listener or enjoy any of the content produced by Philokalia Ministries, we humbly ask that you consider becoming a contributor. You can learn more about our funding needs at www.philokaliaministries.org. Please note that Philokalia Ministries is not a 401c3 nonprofit organization and that contributions are not tax deductible. Supporting Philokalia Ministries is just like supporting your other favorite podcasters and content creators, and all proceeds pay the production bills, make it possible for us to pay our content manager, and provide a living stipend for Father David. God bless you, and enjoy the podcast.
Glory to Jesus Christ, glory forever. Okay, welcome back to our study of the Evergentinos, and we are picking up this evening on page 127 of volume 2 with paragraph 8 at the very bottom of the page. And if you remember, we've been talking these last weeks about the practice of fasting and abstinence among the fathers and mothers of the desert, and the love in particular of these specific forms of asceticism, that they began to see how fruitful they were, both in terms of deepening one's prayer life, of humbling the mind and body, of ordering the appetites. And it's an interesting progression here. I've been reading ahead, and we are talking about fasting in this hypothesis, and then we're given one story after another about how it was practiced by individual monks, at times in a very severe way. And then in the following hypothesis, they begin to talk about practicing it in a measured fashion, not going to extremes. That these particular hypotheses that we're looking at stress the importance of it and how essential it is for the spiritual life. But then we move very quickly to discussing how it is to be done without falling into extremes. So eating a little bit every day, but not to the point of becoming satiated. So very early on in the monastic life, a kind of regular fast begins to emerge, a daily fast, but no longer than 24 hours. That what they began to discover over time is that the body could be weakened too much if one would prolong the fast beyond that period of time, or one could be led into pride by the evil one. And so things sort of balance out over the course of time. We have to remember that the desert was very much like a laboratory in regards to the spiritual life. And so they learn from each other over the course of time and through experience. And so some of the stories that we hear will sound rather extreme as we move forward, but expect that things will sort of level off as we move forward. So don't become disturbed, in other words, when we hear some of these stories. So again, we're picking up with number 8 on page 127. Abba Isaiah was once visited by a certain brother. The Abba washed the brother's feet, afterwards putting a handful of lentils into a pot and lighting a fire. When the water began to boil, Abba Isaiah took the pot off the fire. Abba, said the brother, the lentils are not cooked yet. He replied, is it not enough for you that you have seen the fire? This too is a consolation. So that it is a consolation to know that the lentils got close to the fire to be warmed and softened up a little bit. But again, I think what we're shown in the Desert Fathers is this wariness of pampering the body or becoming attached to certain comforts. And again, for all of us, this seems very extreme, but for the Desert Fathers, their purpose of going to the desert was to engage in this kind of spiritual warfare, this deep asceticism that instructs us in terms of how the passions manifest themselves, how they can be remedied. But we're not necessarily to emulate the example or the extreme measures that especially some of the early monks embraced. I think we talked a little bit in the group last time that wherever, say, a new religious order develops within the church, or even within monasticism itself in its beginnings, it has to be guided by the spirit and the mind of the church. And so this is why you begin to see roles of life begin to develop and become more the norm. Because sometimes the charism of the initial founders of even the monastic movement, Paul the Hermit, who lived in absolute solitude, Anthony the Great, Macarius, so many of these early individuals went deep into the desert. The isolation was great, only coming to the monasteries rarely for liturgy, but they lived on very little. Whereas what we see emerge throughout the course of time is that the preference was for the common life in terms of learning the essentials of monasticism, of the spiritual life as a whole. This is, again, where one learns the ABCs of the spiritual life is within the community. It's only the rare individuals that would embrace the life of an anchorite, of deep solitude, because there's a kind of danger, if you remember, that one can precisely fall into extremes or fall into despondency and not have anybody to support them. And so we want to keep this in mind, even as we're reading these stories, that they're emphasizing for us the essential practice of the ascetic life. But again, it's to be tempered by an understanding of the human person and what we need on both a physical and emotional level as well as spiritual. Number 9. Abba John the Short said, if the fathers of Scetis would eat bread and salt, they compelled themselves even to do this. That is to say, they did not even eat these things without restraint. For this reason, they had the strength to fulfill the commandments of God. So they had to force themselves, as it were, to eat bread and salt, that they lived in the desert, and so they needed sustenance to be able to carry out their daily obediences. But again, it was something that they had to hold themselves back from, not giving themselves, again, more than what was necessary to sustain them, so not eating to the point of satiation. Although bread and salt does not sound like very much so to live upon. When you read Cassian's conferences, there's a balance that comes forward within his writings, and we figured it out when reading the conferences. The amount of bread that they did eat daily was rather significant, so it did move in this direction if they made sure that they had enough to sustain themselves. Number 10. Abba Cassian related how Abba John, the Abba of a large cenobium, once visited Abba Paisius, who had lived for 40 years in the remotest part of the desert. He loved the elder very much and was able to speak frankly with him. And so he said to him, what have you accomplished by living in solitude for so many years, where you are not easily disturbed by people? Abba Paisius answered, since I became a solitary, the sun has never seen me eating, nor has it ever seen me angry, replied Abba John. So, what the solitaries, when living well and having been formed well, found that they could embrace a level of asceticism that really did push themselves, that they could not eat during daylight, and so they could maintain that daily fast, but to such an extent that it would humble the mind and the heart again, where one would be free from anger. And believe it or not, the life of a solitary is often the struggle would be with anger. You would think living the common life would be a place where that would emerge. But left in solitude, you're sort of left in this state on your own, with no one to console or comfort. And the mind and the thoughts can begin to run. And if you remember the story that from Cassian as well, that a monk tripping over a piece of wood becomes, you know, terribly angry at this inanimate object for getting in his way, that he still had within him this very strong passion. It's really the common life that softens the edges. And so if one is living in solitude, one has to be very aware of what's going on within the heart. And there becomes a need for humbling the mind and the body in this consistent way, because you don't have the typical things of the common life that are shaping the mind and the heart. And hopefully you've done that prior to entering into solitude. But what we see in him is that he had to have this deep fast and deep prayer in order then to overcome one of these fundamental passions that we struggle with. That our tendency is to direct that insensitive faculty that should be directed at sin or the provocation of the evil one outward. And that anger can still arise within the heart, even though no one's around. And so he tells Cassian here that what he's experienced in this life of solitude was through the depth of the fasting, a freedom from even anger itself, which, you know, again, can be one of the great passions of the solitary, as well as despondency, which is this kind of spiritual sadness. Number 11, a certain elder lived as a solitary in the cenobium of St. Theodosius the Cenobiarch, and for 30 years he observed the following rule. He ate bread and water only once a week and labored constantly, and he never left early from the church. So he maintained, again, this rigorous fast for all these years, but never left early from the church as well. Typically a sign of struggle in the spiritual life is the beginning of a distaste for religious services, and either to skip them or not participate in them at all, or to leave early. And so this is why this point is being made, that one of the signs of weakening in the spiritual life is, again, this distaste for the common worship. And I think we see it in ourselves. You know, there are times where either through negligence or laziness, or because we're struggling with despondency, we don't want to go. You know, we don't want to be around others or participate in something. And at times, like the liturgy, and at times it can seem, you know, boring to us or even frustrating to us on a number of levels. We lose sight of what is taking place at the altar. And so this is what the monk is saying, that, you know, part of the evidence of the fruit of his asceticism is that he never, not only did he never miss, but he never left early. This is a big thing. So this should be no surprise for us in the church. I mean, people run for the parking lot half the time after liturgy. And again, I think when the mind and the heart has been formed, you know, to be nourished upon living waters or upon the bread of life, that there should be this desire to linger in that love. And, you know, maybe it's the way that we celebrate it, or the way that we prepare or don't prepare ourselves, that we don't experience that. But one of our struggles, you know, despondency isn't talked about often enough. You know, I think we go through these periods of our life where our heart feels like it's been turned to stone, and prayer feels like it's an impossibility for us. And to make our way forward through that is no light thing. Usually the deepest prayer emerges on coming out the other side of that. But there can be these times where we don't want to participate and lose that desire for prayer, even when it is the Holy Eucharist. And so what they're saying here is important for us, even though we live within the world, we're just susceptible to it. Number 12. It was said of Abba Macarius that whenever he had the occasion to eat with the brothers, he set the following rule for himself. If there was wine, drink it for the sake of the brothers. But for every cup of wine, you will not drink water for a whole day. The brothers would give him wine for the sake of refreshment, and the elder would drink it with joy in order to goad himself. But his disciple, who knew about the matter, said to the brothers, "In the name of God, do not give him wine, for otherwise he will torture himself in his cell." When the brothers learned this, they did not offer him wine anymore. These stories, even in the severity of them, are at times funny to me. This idea that, okay, I'm going to enter into the joy of a common meal with the brothers, but having given myself something that's part of my role not to have, I'm going to take upon myself another discipline. This would be a great little story in terms of, how Friday typically don't eat meat. And, often people say, well, if you don't follow that, then you embrace some other discipline. There's been sort of a lightening of the restriction on eating meat on Fridays, and sometimes limited to Lent, and sometimes people don't do it at all. But you're supposed to replace that discipline outside of Lent, certainly with some other form. But this is a good example of that, that he's forced out of his prayer role for a greater thing, for charity, and to be able to experience joy with his brothers. But he takes upon himself another discipline, and one that is perhaps even harder. Both were hard for him to, break it, but then not to drink water for a whole day, as a way to, in a sense, keep himself moving forward, not to lighten his spiritual discipline for small reasons. Not that charity is a small reason, but, he doesn't want to sacrifice spiritual gains or make himself more vulnerable by letting go of something, because, one could be running over to one's brothers every night for a glass of wine and, quite easily. In fact, they had to be told, stop giving him wine for goodness sake. He's torturing himself, because of it. So it's a good thing to remember, don't let go of that regularity in the ascetic life. And, it bears repeating over and over again that Christianity is an ascetical religion, that we exercise our faith. We're in this spiritual battle against principalities and powers, as well as against our own vulnerabilities that come through our attachment to sin, our disordered appetites. And so maintaining a regular practice is essential for us. It doesn't necessarily mean extreme, but strong enough that it's, again, not pampering the body, that we are engaged in a spiritual warfare, and we are to train as one who's engaged in warfare. And, again, we understand that with everybody else. A boxer trains every day. He watches his appetite, is very disciplined. And so it is for those engaged in spiritual battle. Number 13. About Abba Mark, the anchorite, it was said that he performed the following spiritual feat for 63 years. He fasted for the entire week, so much so that some thought that he had transcended human nature. He worked night and day, and whatever he earned from his labor he gave to the poor. He never accepted anything from anyone. To those who gave to him he would say, "I have no need to accept anything, for my handiwork sustains me, as as do those who come to me for God's sake. So, there was a level, as we've seen in so many saints, East and West, that there can be this discipline that develops over the course of time. Again, that seems extreme for us, but I think the more important message is that we often need a lot less than we imagine. That in the human imagination, we think that we are going to get sick. And so we often fall into a kind of hypochondria, that unless we are eating so many times a day and get so many calories and are making sure that we're drinking a couple gallons of water a day, we are going to make ourselves sick. Or same thing with other appetites, sleep. Unless we get 8 hours of sleep, that, we're going to be so tired we won't be able to do our work, or again, we'll get sick. And so we can be very focused on the body, but in this fearful measure. And I think part of what the asceticism of the fathers teaches us is not only not to pamper the body, but not to let it become a source of anxiety for us, or that we elevate it above our spiritual well-being. That the body is essential in the spiritual battle. It's part of who we are. But in terms of who we are as human beings, the spiritual is of a higher order than the physical. And so we want to use our body to engage in the spiritual battle, but we don't want to elevate it in its importance that it weakens us spiritually. Any thoughts or comments so far? Anybody want to quit yet, or are you okay? All right, number 14. A certain disciple said concerning his Abba that for 20 whole years he never lay down on a bed to sleep, but slept sitting on a seat at which he worked. In all these years, he ate only every 2, 4, or even 5 days. And when he ate, he kept one hand stretched out in prayer and ate with the other. When I asked him, his disciple said, why he did this? The elder answered, I bring the judgment of God before my eyes, and I cannot remain at rest. On one occasion, the disciple continued, the elder went out into the yard and found me sleeping. He then stood over me and wept, saying in lamentation, where on earth is his mind, that he sleeps thus without a care? And so the appetite here becomes one of both eating and sleeping. So never laying down, never putting oneself in this full condition of undisturbed rest, that one, again, has to be like a servant, standing, attentive to the master's call. And so to be able to hear and pick up the sound of the voice of God calling one to prayer, or again to be like a watchman, watching for the evil one's approach, who's coming to steal what is of most value to us, what is most precious. So always sleeping in this position of being alert. In Egypt, there's one of the old cells has a chain hanging from the ceiling, to which the monk would they would wear their hair long, tie his hair to it. So at night when his head would bob, if he were falling asleep, it would be enough to jar him awake. Some of us would be probably hairless after a very short period of time. But in any case, it was, again, to keep himself alert so that he could pray throughout the hours of night. Again, vigils was a very, very important thing for them. To break the night for sleep. To break the night and one sleep for prayer. Then it's often the quietest. Again, the mind and the heart has been humbled at those times. So it's often the sweetest time for prayer. And so, not only did he fast, but he fasted from sleeping. And then in guiding his disciple, seeing him enter into it so easily, he even weeps over it. And again, to us that might seem like a strange thing, but for a monk coming into the desert, precisely to embrace this life and this discipline, it causes him sorrow. Why come to the desert? Why come to this extreme environment if you're not going to enter into it fully? And I think that's true for any vocation that we might have. And it's a good thing to ask ourselves, am I entering into the life that God has called me to as fully as possible? From thinking about our baptismal vows to, marriage vows or priestly, religious, am I living that from moment to moment to the fullest extent? Number 15. Another elder dwelt in a distant desert, and a certain brother who visited him found him in poor health. He therefore washed him, and from the provisions that he was carrying, cooked a small meal, which he gave to the elder to eat. The elder then said to him, "In truth, brother, I had forgotten that people had such refreshment as this." The brother also offered him a cup of wine, on seeing which he wept, saying, "I did not expect to drink wine until my death." And so he's given consolation, comfort by a brother in his illness. But we see in his response to it, the depth, again, of his asceticism, that he had grown used to living meagerly, to say the least. And so to receive what was necessary to heal him of his illness, especially wine, thinking that, I would not see this, for the rest of my life, it again moves him to tears. And, when we step back and think about this in terms of our own ascetical life, would there be, this kind of movement within the heart that we value and hold precious? Remember, the subtitle of this hypothesis is to love fasting. And so would we be moved to tears in one way or another, either seeing ourselves not practice being, indolent or lazy, negligent, or would we, weep when somebody offers us, something in abundance, thinking that we, haven't experienced this for a long time? Is there within us this drive to give ourselves over fully to Christ and to overcome even the slightest attachment to sin that would pull us away from him? Bob wrote, "Is the elder hastening his own death excessively?" This was a danger at times within the desert. So I think whether it was true in this case, I don't know. I mean, his brother comes to his aid. But I think this is why we move very quickly in the text to talking about embracing things in a measured way. That the idea is not to hate the body. And, we don't want to foster a negative anthropology where we see the body as an enemy. In some ways, it functions like that for us at times. And seems to torture us with its appetites, but we have to see it as also an ally. And this is where the balance has to be maintained in the spiritual life. We realize that because of our attachment to our own pleasures and needs and wants, and emotionally we're attached to things like food to help us make it through difficult days. That while that's true, we also rely upon the body in helping us to engage in the spiritual battle. So we don't want to make ourselves sick in the practice of it. And we realize if we do so, then we hobble ourselves spiritually. What is the use of limiting our sleep so much that we can't keep ourselves awake to pray, or we hurt ourselves, our minds or our bodies in such a way that we aren't able to pray for a long period of time? And St. Philip Neri said, it's better to give the body a little bit too much than too little. And he was very much of the mindset of the Desert Fathers. But I think he also realized that, the evil one can work on us in as rigorous a fashion to draw us into the extremes in the opposite direction, to fashion an asceticism that's in accord with our own judgment. And again, the hypothesis after this will emerge here, and in particular, St. Syncletica telling us that this is exactly what can happen, that the evil one, seeing this movement towards asceticism, then will draw us to the extreme. And so we have to avoid both. So the short answer to your question is, I don't know about this particular monk, but they did often fall into extremes, and it's put before us in an unvarnished fashion, so that we don't hesitate to look at it. That we're meant to see their flaws at times, and even people like St. John Vianney, the cure of Ars. When he was an older man, he acknowledges that in his zeal, that at times he went a little too far. Like, I think it was for 6 or 7 years of his life that he ate a boiled potato a day. And he cooked them all at the beginning of the week, so you can imagine what day 7's boiled potato would look like. It wouldn't look very good. But, so he acknowledged both with his sleep, and he was constantly engaged in this spiritual battle, very much like Padre Pio. The demonic attack became very fierce because of the depth of the life of prayer and the asceticism. But even he acknowledged, I went to extremes, and at times perhaps injured myself in doing so. So one has to be humble in the practice of the ascetic life, and this is why spiritual guidance is always needed. It's best to have one spiritual father or spiritual mother there to guide you along the way. Susanna writes, when I was a girl, we fasted on bread and water on Fridays, but after a while stopped because virtue is harder to practice, making it pointless if no charity is left. Yeah, that can be true, and I think especially, and this is part of what the fathers learned, is that the regular fast that allows a person to eat daily, but not to the point of satiation, allows one to fulfill the demands of charity, and also the demands of prayer, one's ascetic life. That to extend a fast for a long period of time, for 3 or 4 days, you may make it through it, but at the end of that feel overly weakened. Or, as you described here, fasting for 1 day a week, but on bread and water with a kind of severity where your body does not have the opportunity to adjust to the lower caloric intake, and as well as the need for a deepening of prayer. This is why everybody on Ash Wednesday becomes mean and cranky. They become hangry, because, they haven't fasted in a year, and then all of a sudden they're fasting and they're wondering why they're cranky and irritable and they have bad breath. It's because, well, they haven't eaten anything, and they have nothing in their stomach, and they can't adjust to it. And they give up. They give up the practice of fasting very quickly, which makes sense, because it's not to be practiced episodically, nor is it to be practiced in the extreme. It has to become a regular part of our spiritual life for us to be able to see the fruit of it. It's connection to Christ being the bread of life, who satisfies the deepest longing of our heart. And so by implicitly then being connected to prayer, that fasting deepens prayer. We experience in our bodily hunger, our hunger for Christ. And so we don't want to do that once a week or once a month, nor do we want to weaken ourselves to the point that we're starving, and then Christ becomes altogether absent to us because we're blinded by our physical weakness, as well as becoming blind to the other right before our eyes and the needs of others. because overly fasting can make us self-focused when we become so aware of, oh my gosh, I'm starving to death here. So again, getting back to Philip Neri, I think that's why he said sometimes it's best to give oneself a little bit more than is necessary. One can always scale back. Susanna writes, right, the regular habit is important and the combination with prayer, right. And this is where, in the hypotheses pulled together is why we have to stick with them, because this is what becomes evident as we go through them. The absolute need for the fasting, but the need to do it in the right way. Let's see, number 17. An elder said, I have seen elders in the desert who have lived here for 70 years and have not eaten anything other than plants and dates. So many of them living a very long life and within religion as monks, but not taking any meat. So living, basically a vegetarian diet, and a very skimpy one at that. And again, this is to call to mind, I think, for us, what is needed for good health. Now, we probably need more than a few plants and dates for good health. But again, what is needed on a daily basis? Do we need Oreos? Do we need Chips Ahoy? Chips Ahoy were my favorite as a kid. I could eat an entire sleeve of Chips Ahoy. They're so addictive, and people are like that with potato chips. I think I bought my mom a bag of what are they called, Fritos, or Cheetos, and they have to put an addictive substance in them, because you could sit, if a person wasn't cautious, you could sit there and pop one after another, and eat a whole bag. And so, again, the extremes that were shown here is meant to make us question, what does eating mean to me? And how does the gift of the Eucharist change how I understand eating? And what Christ says about fasting in the gospel, how does that change the way that I understand eating as a part of being a human being now? It's more because it's more than a discipline. And it's certainly not punishing the body. It's about love. And it's about experiencing a hunger and desire for Christ and his love. Cameron Jackson writes, despondency. I can get how one can transcend Judas like despair. God is good. He can forgive all our sin, but despair of life itself is another thing. I'm old. My money is running out. I can't protect my family from every present evil, etc. God doesn't guarantee quality of life. How do you think this through? Life is suffering. Get used to it. Well, actually, there's a little bit of truth to that, a lot of truth to that last question. I think the norm that our world puts forward to us, as though it should happen, is happiness. That's the norm. And it's not that we shouldn't give thanks to God and be grateful for the joys that we have in life, relationships, friendships, the spiritual gifts as well as material gifts at times, that we would thank God for them. But life in this world isn't necessarily going to be happy, and it's not happy for a lot of individuals. What we are seeking in Christ is an invincible joy, but it's not the joy that the world promises. And we're looking for an invincible peace, but it's not the peace that the world offers. If the world offers it to us and to our family members, that's wonderful. We do everything to, protect those that we love and provide for them. But the reality of living in a fallen world means that we are going to experience aging, illness, diseases, failure, losing our job. Any of these things can happen, and the mind and the heart has to be prepared for that reality. Because often I think when the norm that society presents to us, you should be happy all the time. then when, of course, that does not last very long, then I think it sets people up for a kind of despair, you know. And even if they're not showing it on the surface, it is, who's the author who writes about the quiet desperation? I can't remember that famous line. Does anybody have that at the tip of their tongue? In any case, you know, often that's the reality for many people within this world. And sometimes it can lead individuals to think that God has abandoned them. You know, where is the love of God in the midst of this? And one has to look at the cross and point there. There is the love which conquers death and tells us that, you know, what takes place within this world does not determine our identity, dignity, our destiny, that there's something far greater that is offered to us. Emerson, most men lead lives of quiet desperation. Thank you. Susanna, you guys are great, very quick to the punch here, but there's some truth in that. You know, I think a lot of times, especially when there's a lack of faith, there can be, and even among those who do have faith, there can be this experience of quiet desperation, a plodding along in life, you know, either resentful of what has not taken place, or, you know, just having given up on, you know, pursuing anything whatsoever because one has no faith that anything deeper can be found. And, you know, often I've talked about some of the contemplatives that I've met in my life that have been the most joyful of individuals, but it's a different kind of joy. You know, they've been through sorrow and chaos and affliction, but it's a joy that at times is very clearly otherworldly. I skipped one, you say, Bob. Number 16? Okay, thank you. A certain brother recounted the following. I knew an elder who lived on a high mountain and refused to accept anything from anyone. He had a little water, and he tended his small vegetable garden from which he lived for 50 years without ever leaving the enclosure of his cell. The elder became renowned for many healings which he continually performed for those who visited him. Thus did he repose in peace, leaving 5 disciples in that place. So, you know, part of the abstemiousness and the fasting is also to be generous towards others, to give alms to others, or not to be a burden to others, that one does a certain amount of work in order to feed oneself. So here he has his own vegetable garden. He's able to live off of that through his life, lives this very simple life, but also then heals others, is able to give himself to others out of the fruit, spiritual fruit that is gained through his ascetic life. But I think in general, fasting and abstaining is, again, you remember St. Peter Chrysologus talks about the 3 legs of the spiritual stool, if you will: fasting, prayer, and almsgiving. And the fasting is really meant to make almsgiving a possibility, that you eat less in order that you might be able to provide for those in need. And I've mentioned here before, you know, my mom's story about her mom providing for those during the Depression. You know, the bread and jams and things like that, the times just kept people going. And so often it is those who have the least that seem to be the most generous or attentive to providing for the basic physical needs of others, and so act with a greater charity. I think in some ways the abundance that we have has almost dulled those sensibilities within us, that we become blind to the need of others, or we see the needs of others as a kind of scam, you know, and often it is that, but better to err on the side of charity. Or one would think that if one is more spiritually astute, that one would be able to discern that and be able to engage a person in the way that they need to be engaged. But nonetheless, I think, you know, having this simple lifestyle can make us more discerning of the needs of others around us. Thanks for picking that up, Bob. Okay. Number 18. Concerning a great elder who lived in the Lavra of Abba Peter, it is said that he remained in his cave for 50 years, neither drinking wine nor eating bread, except for bran, and that three times a week. Well, at least he stayed regular if he ate bran 3 times a week, and so no bread or wine. And so the monks learned to be sustained upon what they had available to them. And again, the simplicity of lifestyle often leads people to be able to do that. It seemed like in a certain age, everybody had a garden. My grandparents had a garden, and everybody, canned and did things in order to be able to provide for for their families. It was a kind of forced simplicity, but it taught them how to live and to be able to provide for themselves and others. And again, I think in our abundance, we throw away a lot more food than, people had at times like that. And so when I read these, and again, it's so striking to hear how limited their diet was and what they did survive on. It's like a bucket of cold water being thrown on you. What do I really need? And does all that I have really produce within the mind and the heart the kind of joy and the peace of the kingdom? Or do I experience a kind of lingering anxiety that is rooted on my being more focused upon the things of this world and protecting my security? And, certainly as priests, I've talked to a lot of people over the course of time, and that is one of the great anxieties. Am I going to have enough? Am I going to find myself wanting if I serve the Lord? Am I going to be put in a position where I'm impoverished? And so even where there is abundance, there's often this deeper anxiety and depression because in the end, those things can't provide what they seem to promise. And I think even really at the heart of the church, it's permeated the very fabric of the church that, especially in the West, that there is to be this abundance, that you have to have this enormous amount of security and communities feeling that they need to raise an enormous amount of money to have that security because of the pressures of paying for health care and all these different things. And it often puts communities in this position of having that become the center of their life. I won't mention any names or anything, but I know of monasteries that they've had their external work become so successful, that is like what they were making, whether it's jams or whatever it was, becomes so successful that their life becomes so busy in order to fulfill all the orders that it alters their common life and the depth of their prayer life. They're overwhelmed by it. And yet there can be this drive to, to make as much as possible to provide for the uncertain future and to, not to, again, want to find the community being diminished or having to deal with hardship. And again, I think that's this mindset, which seems very much contrary, again, to the gospel in its unvarnished fashion. Consider the lilies of the field or the birds of the air. Don't be anxious for tomorrow because today's evil is enough in itself to deal with. It's not going to help you to be anxious about tomorrow or 10 years down the line. And yet we are. We're terrified about it rather than living today and embracing what it is that God has provided for us. And so living moment to moment, certainly these stories are jarring in that, but they did. That's how they lived, by the grace of God. Okay, hypothesis number 17. So moving from this, they want to move very quickly to say, okay, be patient, that the hyperbole of some of these stories can throw a person into a kind of despair and not being able to do that. So do not fear, we're told, but rather embrace the exercise of patience. That it's no small thing to develop the capacity to fast regularly or to pray with the regularity that we would desire as well. So from Palladius, who's known really for providing us with the little bits of the life and biography of all these early characters within the early church in the desert. So if you have a chance, there's a wonderful little volume by him where all these stories, some of them only a paragraph or two long, about so many of the different individuals that come forward in these stories in the Evergentinos. St. Macarius of Alexandria did not practice just one form of asceticism, but different kinds. That is, if he heard that a certain struggler had performed one kind of asceticism, he was eager not only to succeed in it, but also to surpass that individual. When he learned from someone that the Tabernestonians, that's close enough, ate uncooked food throughout the Great Fast, he forbade himself to use fire in preparing food for 7 years. He would eat only raw vegetables, and if he could find any, moistened legumes. So, if there was a competitiveness, it was in the ascetic life. That if he would hear of a certain ascetical practice that it revealed to him that he was clinging to something, that he would embrace it and even go further than that. Again, there would be a certain danger with this, I think, in the sense of becoming prideful in the practice of it. There's a better story later on where we're told that a person each year would embrace a different form of asceticism that was focused on a particular passion. And to me, that makes more sense, that one learns through experience, and there are certain practices in the spiritual life that strengthen us in overcoming the passions. And so to learn from others and perhaps take up things that we haven't thought about embracing in our own life for the spiritual benefit of it. Subsequently, he heard from someone else that a certain elder ate only 1 litra of bread. I did look that up. It's 27 grams, which again doesn't sound like very, very much. He thus broke up the ration of hard bread that he had, placed the bread in a jar, and decided to eat every day only as much as his hand could extract from it. He used to relate to us jokingly, I got hold of quite a few morsels, but I could not remove them all, since the neck of the jar was too narrow. This tax collector, that is the weakness of the flesh, does not permit me to forgo food completely. So, putting food in a jar that is difficult to remove would slow you down. And, again, and one might say, all right, this is extreme. But, I know in my own life, one of the challenges is eating too quickly. And slowing oneself down it can be a very important thing, to eat in a contemplative fashion. And so monks, when they would make their movement to the refectory, it's typically after prayer, and one makes this movement in silence to the refectory, and then there's a period of waiting until the bells are rung, indicating that the meal is ready, and then prayers are said, and then usually a reading. Part of a reading is done, and then the meal begins, and then reading is done throughout the meal as a whole, But all this, what I'm getting to, is it fosters a contemplative approach to eating, and slows a person down. That often when we eat, and we eat quickly, we're eating because of our nervousness, or if we're hungry, we eat too quickly, and our mind doesn't catch up to the body until we've overeaten and feel sick, or we've gone beyond what we need, again, to sustain ourselves. So if we learn from anything from this, funny story, trying to pick bread out of a little, sounds like a Coke bottle, trying to get, a little morsel of bread out with your fingertips, slowing ourselves down, is a good thing. I think we all know in the West here that our portions are huge in restaurants, but also we've gotten used to that. And it's interesting, the first time I went abroad, my dad and I went on a pilgrimage together, and to Rome and Florence, and I was supposed to come back and give a talk, and so I studied the catacombs. But in any case, long story made short, we went to dinner the first night we got there, and it was like 5:30, and they said, come back later. Our dinner is like starts at 7:30. And so that threw us off right away because we were, used to the old folks timing there. But in any case, if you order meat, it's like this little portion. And it's surprising when you first encounter it, because here in the United States, people have these huge steaks and really thick. And when you go to a meal in some place like Rome, I suppose you could eat excessively there as well, but the portions typically are much smaller, and it's an eye-opener. And same thing with like grocery stores, going to Egypt and things like that. You think, goodness sake, what we have here would probably throw people into shock, if they were to see it. And so again, these stories, I think, are meant to slow us down, literally, how fast, how quickly we eat, but, the time that we give ourselves to consider how much do I really need, or is this good for me, spiritually as well as physically. And remember, we've talked about eating those rich and heavy meals, how difficult it can make it to pray following them, because your body is digesting. And the heavier meal that you have, the longer that takes. And again, Philip Neri used to say, you should be able to go into the chapel and pray after you've eaten a meal, if you're, eating in the correct way. You shouldn't immediately fall into a food coma, after you've had supper. Okay. That actually brings us to 8:30, but does anybody have any comments or questions or concerns about anything that we talked about here tonight? Okay. So be very patient with us here. We're moving in this direction, again, to the teaching on moderation and avoiding the extremes. Okay. So it's great to be with you again and to be in the house, have a little stability. Again, so looking forward to Wednesday as well for the latter. So why don't we close as always with our Father, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Go in peace. God bless everybody. Not to give the
What you are about to listen to is a podcast produced by Philokalia Ministries. Philokalia Ministries is offered to all free of charge. However, there are real and immediate needs associated with it. If you are a regular listener or enjoy any of the content produced by Philokalia Ministries, we humbly ask that you consider becoming a contributor. You can learn more about our funding needs at www.philokaliaministries.org. Please note that Philokalia Ministries is not a 401c3 nonprofit organization and that contributions are not tax deductible. Supporting Philokalia Ministries is just like supporting your other favorite podcasters and content creators, and all proceeds pay the production bills, make it possible for us to pay our content manager, and provide a living stipend for Father David. God bless you, and enjoy the podcast.
Glory to Jesus Christ, glory forever. Welcome back, everybody, to our study of the Evergentinos. And we are picking up this evening with hypothesis number 17. And so we're on page 131, if you're following along, and picking up with number 3 at the bottom of the page. Over these past weeks, we've been discussing apps and the importance of fasting, but also the love of these particular practices. And we've been making our way through a series of stories of how the monks engaged in the practice. And it's interesting, what we're going to see evolve in this hypothesis and the next is a leveling out of how they practiced it, what they learned from experience. And so it's a fascinating thing to witness as we go through the fathers. We see the zeal that develops for it and the love of fasting and the absolute necessity in their minds of practicing it and practicing it deeply. But we also see a moderation that takes place that avoids extremes. So a daily kind of fasting or eating only enough that is necessary for satiation or brings the person up to that point, but not eating in excess. And so typically they were eating once a day, but they moved away very quickly from extending the fast more than the 24-hour period because they began to realize not only did it make the monks too fatigued to do their work, but it also had a negative effect upon their prayer life. If they were too tired, they wouldn't be able to maintain that discipline either. So they knew and understood the humbling of the mind and the body as being necessary, but it had to be done with restraint and wisdom. And again, it's a wonderful thing to see it unfold for us here in the practice of the monks themselves as we go through these hypotheses. So again, on page 131, number 3. After that, for a further 3 years, he imposed this abstinence on himself. He would eat 4 or 5 ungiai, that is 27 grams of bread, and drink a corresponding amount of water. So St. Macarius of Alexandria, there's 2 St. Macariuses, Alexandria and of Egypt. Both were great ascetics, but not to be confused with each other. But so a minimal amount again, but what was necessary along with the amount of water for daily sustenance. And we've talked a little bit about this in the past, that we often have a sense of needing more than what we do to survive on a day-to-day basis and to remain healthy and to be able to do our work. And as we'll see in their writings, that they are not only able to do their works, but their forms of obedience, but also maintain this deep spiritual and prayer life. Number 4, the adamantine ascetic resolved to conquer sleep too, as he later accounted, for 20 whole days and nights. He did not enter his cell, but remained in the open air, where he was burned by the extreme heat of the day and frozen by the cold of the night, in order to overcome sleep. If I had not decided early on, he said, To stand under the roof of my cell, I would have gone out of my mind because my brain was burning. As much as I could then, he continued, I overcame sleep. I submitted to it only as much as was absolutely indispensable for the needs of nature in order to satisfy these needs. I allowed myself to sleep a little. So again, we see them, as it were, experimenting with all the appetites that we have as human beings, including that of sleep. And once more, the examples seem very extreme. Standing outside, sleeping in the open air, only getting out of the sun so he didn't fry his brain is basically what he's talking about here. And so, undoubtedly, it sounds to modern ears, or to anybody's ears, to be extreme, and it was. And so we see again they're moderating it in what is to come. Again, we have to remember that the desert was a kind of laboratory. And I think that's always helpful to keep in mind as we go through the readings, that there weren't these great ascetics before them, that they go out for a particular reason, that the church had been embraced by the culture, a kind of malaise had begun to set in, and so they go out to the desert to engage in this deep asceticism. But there were no rules of life at that period of time. And so a lot had to be learned through experience. And so the writings of the fathers aren't without stories of certain monks falling into great dangers or harming their health by going to these extremes. And so we don't want to romanticize everything that certainly we read here. We have to be critical readers and understand that they were critical as well, examining why they were doing it, the motivations that they had, and whether or not it was within the boundaries of reason, that if it was excessive or if it was something that truly did help them. And so keeping in mind the sense of it being the desert being a laboratory that has given us this wealth of insight psychologically and spiritually to the movements of the human mind and spirit, but nonetheless was fraught with certain dangers. Number 5, on one occasion, this saint was sitting in his cell and a mosquito stung him on the foot. In pain, he killed the mosquito with his hand after it had drunk its fill of blood. Afterwards, when he had repented for taking vengeance on the mosquito that had injured him with its sting, he imposed the following penance on himself. He went into the inner desert where the marshes of Scetis were located. There, in the stagnant waters, the mosquitoes were the size of wasps and could puncture even the hides of wild boars with their stings. He stayed in that place naked for a period of 6 months, and the mosquitoes devoured his flesh to the extent that lumps like thick calluses broke out over his entire body. When he returned to his cell, he had become so disfigured that even those who knew him did not recognize him. They recognized him as St. Martyrius the Great, not from his face, but from his voice. Others who saw him, but were unaware of what had happened, thought that he had suffered from an attack of elephantitis, such as was the great endurance displayed by this athlete of Christ. So, again, very extreme. And I was surprised about the mosquitoes in Egypt. I wouldn't have thought there would be any in the arid environment of the desert. But what is being described here is exactly true. I went on a little pilgrimage there, and I've mentioned this once before. We encountered these mosquitoes at night, and so we sprayed ourselves all over. And the one priest pulled the sheet up over his head at night, and we got up in the morning, like at 3 a.m. for their vigils to join the monks. And a mosquito had bitten him on the bottom lip, and his lip swelled up like the Nutty Professor. It was like 5 times the normal size. And it was rather humorous at the time, except to him. But the environment there is quite rigorous for a lot of different reasons, and this was one of them. But I think, again, the thing to focus on is not the extreme or even doing this with mosquitoes. I think it's overcoming the human will and the need to pamper the body or to focus on self-comfort that we are so typically drawn to. The passions typically will feed off of this for us. Our tendency to want to soothe ourselves through our appetites and through the comforts of life that we can embrace. And so in this environment, one of the things they were trying to overcome was the tendency to cling to those things, to break attachment with the world or anything that would give rise to the passions. Often when you hear the word world used in the writings of the fathers, what they are speaking about are the passions as a whole or the individual passions in particular. And so what they were seeking to do was to break down that tendency to focus more on the body than on the soul. And they would go, as you see here, to great extremes to overcome the things that they abhorred. And certainly somebody getting bitten by a mosquito the size of a wasp would be disgusted by it, let alone being devoured by them. And so there were some of these holy fools, if you will, from our perspective, who were willing to let themselves be overcome in order to be free from any discomfort. And certainly this, again, was another example of an extreme one. Number 6. When the same Macarius was informed that the Tavanesiotans, strict in their way of life, he changed his clothing and donned the garb of a layman, walked for 15 days, and went up to the Thebaid. On reaching the monastery, he asked them to notify Archimandrite Pachomius, a man endowed with the gift of prophecy, of his arrival. By divine providence, though, the spirit did not reveal Macarius' circumstances to him. When they had invited him into the monastery, and he met Pachomius, Macarius said to him, "I beseech you, my lord, to accept me into your monastery, so that I may become a monk." "You are already an old man," St. Pachomius the Great replied to him. "How will you be able to cope with the ascetic life? There are brothers here who have devoted themselves to this discipline from their youth, having been brought up with hard work, and who can endure the rigors of asceticism. At your age, however, you will not be able to withstand such labors and exertions. Rather, you will give up hope and return to the world, where you will speak ill of us and cause very serious harm to yourself." So, unwittingly, Pachomius, who himself was known for his greatness in the ascetic life, and as we mentioned, he was the first to establish a role of life, and very quickly there were hundreds, if not even thousands, of monks who had gathered to live the life under this rule. And so he's right, there were some who had embraced this life from their youth, and so were used to the rigor of it. And so for an older man to present himself at the monastery, it would be an unusual thing for them to be willing to take him, thinking that, it's interesting how he puts it, that he won't be able to cope and perhaps do himself harm, but then perhaps go back into the world and badmouth them for their way of life, that they either did not receive him or that the life that they lived was extreme. It goes on, thus Pachomius did not accept him, but dismissed him. Macarius, however, did not leave, but remained for 7 days outside the monastery gate without eating. On learning this, Pachomius called him inside again and repeated what he told him previously. Macarius then said to him, "Please accept me, Abba, and if I do not fast as the brothers do, and do not work as they do, then order them to throw me out of the monastery." After this, Pachomius accepted him and enrolled him in the monastery brotherhood. That monastery has 1,400 monks to this day. After a short time had elapsed, the great fast began. So, one of the details among the monastics is often this period of testing of desire for the monastic life, that individuals can pursue the religious life because they're running from something in their life, or they've romanticized or idealized their life. And so often you will hear little stories like this where they will be put to the test or first denied entry altogether. And Macarius is able to stay outside the gate of the monastery and not eat for an entire week, which is then enough to let Pachomius invite him in to join them and enter into what was coming, Lent itself, so the great fast of the monastery, because he had sort of, in some way, had proved himself. And that's still a bit in the East. It's part of the mindset. It's sort of interesting. There's a desire to see desire, if you will, within the heart. Well, whether it's for young men who are pursuing vocations to the priesthood, women entrance into the convent, the monastery, or similarly with monks as well, to put that desire to the test. The elder saw that the brothers gave themselves over to various kinds of ascesis. One would eat in the evening, as was customary, another would every 2 days, and another every 5 days, while another would keep vigil, standing up the entire night, and occupy himself with work during the day. Each one, in short, would apply himself to a different sort of ascesis in proportion to his eagerness and ability. So Macarius, after moistening a sufficient number of palm shoots, stood in a corner of the monastery, and until Lent had passed and Pascha arrived, ate no bread at all, did not drink water, did not bend his knees, did not lie down, and did not eat anything other than a few raw cabbage leaves every Sunday. And he did this, in my opinion, so as to give the impression that he was eating and to avoid falling into pride. He did not talk to anyone, insignificant or important, but stood in silence, attending to himself and conversing constantly with God in his heart through prayer while he plaited the palm shoots with his hands. So he encounters the great rigor among these monks. They had developed a kind of notoriety, in fact, for their asceticism. And we see the various examples. Pachomius was sort of interesting in his role, that there was a role of prayer that the monks had to follow, but by monastic standards, it was fairly reasonable. It wasn't excessive. And there was still a lot of room, I think, for individual expression and approach to one's daily disciplines as well as additional prayers. And we sort of pick that up here within the reading, that the practices, even the practices of fasting, varied from monk to monk. But the surprising thing is that this old man, who Pachomius did not think had it within him, basically goes on very little sleep, almost no eating, no lying down, for the entire great fast. And it becomes sort of a great source of surprise, as we will see, to the young monks here. When the brothers saw this extreme endurance, they went to Pachomius and told him, Abba, whence did you bring us this incorporeal man to be a living condemnation of us with his asceticism? Either expel him from here, or be assured that we will take leave of you today. When Pachomius the Great had learned about the man and his superhuman feats, he prayed to God that he would disclose to him the identity of this man who displayed such endurance. God revealed to him that it was Martyrius, the monk. So it's interesting, this extraordinary ability on the part of Macarius, that he lived like, they said, an incorporeal being, that he lived like an angel. He didn't seem to need sleep or food. It becomes something that is so humbling to them that they give an ultimatum to Pachomius: get rid of him now, or we're leaving the monastery today. They could not bear his presence. Sort of an interesting thing, isn't it? That despite one's discipline and great asceticism at that, that one can sort of cling to this reputation of being a great ascetic, and they all stand revealed by this old man, to the point then of wanting to give up the monastic life if Pachomius allows him to remain. They're being humiliated by this old man. So Pachomius immediately went up to him, took him by the hand, and led him to the chapel. There, after embracing him, he said to him, "Come now, venerable father, you are Macarius. Why did you conceal this from me? For many years, ever since I heard about you, I've been wanting to make your acquaintance. I owe you a debt of gratitude for humbling my spiritual children, lest they become prideful about their asceticism. Go now to your own place, I beg you, because you have contributed enough to our spiritual edification, and please pray for us." Then, after the brothers had honored him fittingly, he departed and went back to his cell. That's an interesting way of putting it. You've contributed enough to our edification. Now, don't let the door hit you on the way out. But I think it is genuine that this Martyrius did have this reputation of extraordinary holiness, and that Pachomius does realize that he revealed something pretty profound that eventually could have brought the community to its knees, the pride of its members, that despite the externals, the asceticism that they had in great measure, that again, their willingness to give up the vocation in the face of being humbled by an old man reveals an incredible weakness within them. They're so prideful that they give an ultimatum to the abbot. So again, I guess it's trite to say never judge by its cover, but it's true of ascetics too. Here's an old man, and where nobody thought this would be possible for him, but by the grace of God, that there was this transformation that took place. And we see this among the saints east and west. Those who by grace and their desire for God were able to do with very little. Catherine of Siena was one, certainly Francis of Assisi, some of them living on the Eucharist for quite a long period of time, or some on very little food or very little sleep. And so I think every once in a while God raises up individuals like this to not only humble us, but to really question ourselves. What is our response to God in the spiritual life? What are we willing to do in order to be free of the passions? And so they become important examples for that reason. Maybe not to emulate them exactly, of course, but to drive us on, to spur us on in the spiritual life and battle. This heavenly man related the following to me. Once I decided not to take my mind off of God for 5 days and not to think about anything material, but to keep my thoughts focused on Him and to have the eyes of my soul trained on otherworldly concepts. After I had finally resolved to do this, I completely closed off my cell and my front yard from the outside world so that I could not respond to anyone who might come, and I commenced my undertaking on a Monday. I exhorted my mind, saying, "Be sure not to descend at all from heaven. There you have the angels, archangels, all of the heavenly hosts, the cherubim and the seraphim, and finally God, the creator of all. Spend your time there. Do not descend beneath heaven, and do not fall into materialistic thoughts." So after abiding in these thoughts for 2 days, he went on to say, "I aggravated the devil so much that he turned himself into a fiery flame and totally consumed everything in my cell, even the rush mat on which I was standing. Thinking I might even be burned up myself, I grew afraid. For this reason, on the 3rd day, I departed from the otherworldly contemplation and descended to contemplating this world and began to think about material things. Thus, I was not given any opportunity to become conceited about this matter." So he's humbled, certainly, by it, by the fierceness of the attack, and then being driven by his fear out of his commitment. But it also speaks to us of someone whose attention is completely directed toward God and the things of the kingdom. That the fierceness of the attack there is great. And if the person's mind and heart is directed only upon the things of the kingdom, on that which is spiritual, then the evil one will often attack on the physical level. And we've mentioned this about a few of the saints before. John Vianney, Padre Pio, a number of them experienced these physical attacks, beatings from the devil himself, with this desire to frighten, to dissuade them from their spiritual practices, anything to pull them out of their prayer life. So completely focused have they become upon God, and so freed have they become from attachment to the things of this world, and material attachments, even such as what is going to be needed for the food of the day. And again, this tells us something important, that, as we enter into the spiritual battle, and as the heart is purified, that the spiritual battle can become all the more fierce, that the greater threat is one who has eyes only for God and the things of the kingdom, who has lost the attachment to the world and the things that give rise to the passions. And so the evil one will do everything within his power, even in the physical realm, to try to draw a person away from the life that they've taken, from the path that they're on. Any thoughts about any of these stories so far? I won't ask if there's anything disturbing. I imagine there has been, but okay. Letter B, halfway down the page on 134. There is a mountain in Egypt which leads to Scetus, and which is called Ferme. About 500 ascetics live on this mountain. Among them, there was once one by the name of Paul, an excellent monk, who throughout his ascetic life observed this practice. He never undertook any work, did not engage in retailing handiwork, and accepted nothing from anyone except for his daily sustenance. He occupied himself constantly in unceasing prayer. He had made it his rule to say 300 prayers every day. After collecting an equal number of pebbles, He would place them in his lap and counted the prayers with them. When he finished one prayer, that is, he would throw one pebble onto the ground. So this is sort of a little famous story. So you might want to mark this a little bit, just because it is something of the origin of the Trotki, of the prayer robe, that the way that they sort of involved the body, the self, in the saying of the prayers was to make use of these pebbles, of having them in their lap and then throwing them into a pile as to help keep them focused, not so much again on the counting as it is to keep their focus upon the prayer itself. And then gradually over the course of time, we find that the prayer robe, the Chakti, develop out of this. So it's one of the few places where I've actually come across this story. So might want to mark it. He once paid a visit to St. Macarius the Great, who was surnamed Politicos, the citizen or patrician, either indicating that he was from the city of Alexandria or opposed to St. Macarius the Egyptian, his elder contemporary, or a reference to his gentility. Hold on for a second. Okay. And said to him, Ave Macarius, I am in great distress. The servant of God, Macarius, then pressed him to tell him the cause of his sorrow. He replied, in a certain village there dwells a virgin who has been practicing asceticism for 30 years now. I have been told of her that with the exception of Saturdays and Sundays, she does not eat at all. She eats every 5 days and says 700 prayers every day. When I heard this, I despaired because although as a man I surpass her in bodily strength, yet I cannot say more than 300 prayers. On hearing this, St. Macarius replied to him, for 60 years now, I have made it my role to say 100 prayers and to work with my hands in order to provide my sustenance. I maintain regular contact with the brothers, and my conscience does not condemn me for having ever neglected anything. So if, in spite of saying 300 prayers, you are condemned by your conscience, it is obvious that your prayer is not pure, and that although you are capable of praying more, you do not do so. So his heart is not pure in one way or another. I think either that he is not praying to the extent that God wills of him or that he's capable of doing. So Macarius tells him, I pray 100 prayers and I focus on providing for my daily sustenance and I engage the brothers and my conscience is free. And so saying to him, I faithfully carry out my prayer role and I'm not bothered by it. And so either he's bothered by the fact that he's not engaging deeply enough in his spiritual life, especially given the way that he had set it up for himself, or he's simply prideful. He's comparing himself to another, and especially comparing himself to one that he feels in his own mind is or should be weaker than him, that he should be able to do more than her. And here she's saying, what was it, 700 prayers? Yeah, 700 prayers a day, and eating, just a couple times a week. And so either he was comparing herself, and so in his pride feels diminished by it, and is seeking his counsel, or he is being lazy or negligent and not embracing the grace that God has given him. He's not being diligent as he should be throughout the course of his day. So either way, the Father reveals to him, this elder reveals to him, that his heart is not pure. And so he needs to examine what his motivations are and what the will of God is for him in his prayer life. There's always a terrible danger in comparing oneself to another person in the spiritual life. And, it's good to have examples to emulate and to look to the saints and their writings and to, be able to talk to confidants in our life. But every person's life is not the same. Different people carry different burdens, have different crosses that they carry, and are given grace to pray in a certain way. And some fast a lot, some maybe not as much, but we don't know what else is going on in their life and who or what they are attending to. And so we need to keep our focus upon God and being as diligent and disciplined as we can be and also in accord with what we need, where our vulnerabilities lie. Sometimes we will get into this further on about the particular passions. And, we may have overcome certain passions, but there might be a handful of others that we've not attended to at all. And so again, it's another reason to keep our focus upon ourselves. We don't know the purity of heart of the other and what they need or what they do not need. All we know with any clarity is what's going on within our own minds and hearts. Spiritual directors and priests have to be very careful about this too, whether it's in the confessional or in giving spiritual counsel. To recognize where the other person is, what are the realities within their life, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and allow that understanding to develop over the course of time, not to be quick to give counsel or to create a role for another person, because you can do great harm to an individual and eventually dissuade them from the spiritual life altogether if you place too much upon them, or if you don't challenge them enough, equally make them fall away from it because they see no fruit from it. So a person has to be whether a spiritual father or spiritual mother, has to, from experience, be able to listen to the one who's coming to them. And again, this isn't something that they teach very well in seminary, either about experience or about listening to the other. That we aren't fixers. We're not trying to fix other people's lives. We're trying to understand who they are, the struggles that they have, how they see Christ, and what is going to be a source of healing for them. A physician who doesn't listen to his patients is likely going to miss the right diagnosis. I'm always impressed by the physicians in our day, because they're a rarity, who actually listen to their patients. My mom has had the experience with, I think, dermatologists, where the young doctors, they're told you have, is it a 10 or 15 minute slot? And my mom asked this one to bandage a wound, from having taken something off. And she said, I'm sorry, my 10 or 15 minutes are up. And then though, if you find a doctor who is getting yelled at by UPMC, that's our main medical facility here in Pittsburgh, or medical group, getting yelled at by their boards and their insurance agents because they're spending 45 minutes or an hour with the patient, those are the doctors to go to, because they're listening to you about your life, your lifestyle, what are the things that contribute to whatever health problems you might be having. They're always the best diagnosticians, and they're a rarity in our day. And but the same is true in the spiritual life. It's not one size fits all. And a spiritual father or mother has to be someone who remains silent and is willing to listen both to what is being said and what is not being said by those coming to them, in order to get a sense of what they are really struggling with. And that can be frustrating to a person who comes and is hurting and is saying, tell me what to do, fix my life. Well, as a spiritual father, you don't want to make it worse. You know, the most I heard from my analyst in training at times was they're dropping their pen on the floor by accident or something like that. You know, and so it could be, and I'm not saying that a priest or a sister or a spiritual director in any way should be like that, but we can learn a lot there about listening on this very deep level, and especially listening through the depth of our own prayer, praying for the other that we might understand or see what we need to see. Let's see. So we're at letter C, is that correct? Yes. Okay. From the same author. A certain ascetic of Thebes, Dorotheos, lived in the boondocks, 5 Samea out of Alexandria. I was entrusted to him by St. Isidore, the presbyter and guest master of the Church of Alexandria. For I had come to the latter originally when I was young and begged him to instruct me in the monastic life. The holy Isidore took me out of the city and led me to Dorotheus the ascetic. He handed me over to him and asked him to teach me the duties of a monk. The elder Dorotheus lived in great hardship. The whole day long, and even in the very heat of noonday, he would gather rocks in the desert near the sea and build cells, which he presented to those who, out of infirmity, were unable to construct their own. I once asked him, Father, what are you doing? At your age, you are killing your body in this severe heat. He replied to me, this, my body, is killing me. I will kill it too. So, you know, this old man realizes that it often is the body that we struggle with. Again, the appetites or the desires or the passions that are often tied to them. And so physical labor, humbling the body, either in one's obediences or in these kinds of work that he's engaged in, or through the practice of fasting and sleep and food, is a way of humbling that body to the point that we enfeeble it, but strengthen the soul in the process. Every day he would eat 6 ungi of bread, that is again 27 grams, and sometimes a few wild greens and a drink about a cup of water. As God is my witness, I never noticed him stretching out his feet or falling onto a rush mat or a bed with the intention of sleeping. He would sit up the whole night and weave baskets out of palm shoots in order to provide his food. Supposing that he was displaying such asceticism now, because I was present, I learned from those who had known him very well from the beginning, since they had at one time been disciples of his, that he had practiced such asceticism even from his youth. He never slept in a normal way, but only inclining his head a little and closing his eyes slightly while working or eating, such that the bread often fell from his mouth as he chewed it on account of his dire need of sleep. So I've found this more and more interesting over time. And, you know, I even came across something online today and saying that there was a guy being interviewed and saying, what are the chances of somebody, you know, functioning well on 5 or 6 hours of sleep? And the guy said with this absolute certainty, 0. And I think to myself, I don't know about that. I've read hundreds, if not thousands, of stories of these, not only desert monks, but the saints who discipline themselves, not for the sake of like worldly work, but discipline themselves for prayer. And you might have often heard It's said by the saints that 1 hour of prayer is equal to 3 hours of sleep, that there's a restorative effect of prayer, of this entering into the life of Christ on a deeper level, that often does raise them up on the supernatural level, where they could either go without food or go without sleep for longer periods of time. And again, in our health-conscious society, where we can be hyper-attentive to the body, even to the point of hypochondria, that the notion of somebody doing something like this and being able to sustain themselves into old age and do physical labor, but also be healthy in mind as well as spirit, would seem nonsensical. But someone who reads the lives of the saints and understands anything about the life of prayer can really nod their head and understand that, being nourished upon you as the bread of life, or having one's thirst quenched by the living waters that Christ offers to us, and, finding rest for our souls in Christ, the one who calls us to himself, that these are individuals who took the Lord at his word in the deepest fashion, and so find themselves nourished in ways that we don't understand on a natural level. And it's only when we begin to taste something of the sweetness of that, and even in the smallest way, of choosing prayer over the kind of restoration that we typically seek, whether it is sleep, 8 to 10 hours a day, or television, or food. If once we begin to back away from those things, we can find ourselves being strengthened in ways that we have never known, and having a clarity of mind about relationships, our work, what it is that we want and desire, a freedom from anxiety, in the trials of life. And so part of, I think, what this is to cultivate is a desire for that we might know what they came to know, not by necessarily imitating them exactly, but taking hold of that same spirit. I once implored him to stretch out a little on a rush mat. He then said to me in sorrow, "If you ever persuade the angels to sleep, you will hereby also persuade him who burns with zeal to imitate them." On another occasion, he sent me at the 9th hour, that is the 3rd hour of the afternoon, to fetch water from the well for us to drink. I saw an asp in the well. I ran back to him in fear and told him, "Abba, we are going to die, for I saw an asp in the well." When he heard this, he smiled a little, looked at me for some time, and then quietly shaking his head, said to me, "If the devil decides to throw asps and snakes, tortoises, or other venomous reptiles into all of the wells, will you stop drinking water?" He went out of his cell, and when he had reached the well, he filled a bucket on his own with water from the well, made the sign of the cross over the water, and was himself the first to drink of it. Wherever the sign of the cross is made, he told me, the evil of Satan is powerless. So it's interesting. Immediately on, following on the story of his great asceticism, then is this kind of fearlessness of the things of this world, and a fulfillment of what Christ promises. They will pick up, venomous creatures and not die. And so the sign of the cross has this extraordinary power. And, but often what is lacking is even that mustard seed of faith that really believes in that. We're like more like the young monk that comes running back, filled with fear and anxiety. How are we going to drink anything? There's an asp in the well. Any comments or questions? Okay. From the Geronticon, Abba Daniel told the following story about Abba Arsenius. He once summoned my spiritual fathers, Abba Alexander and Abba Zolos, and humbling himself said to them, since the demons make war on me, and I do not know whether they seize me during my sleep, I beseech you to struggle together with me tonight and observe whether I become drowsy while I keep vigil. So starting in the evening, one of them sat on his right, the other at his left, without saying anything. The two abbas subsequently related what happened. We went to sleep and woke up, but we did not notice him becoming at all sleepy. In the morning, we only saw him breathe deeply 3 times, and at once he arose and said, yes, I certainly felt sleepy. We replied that we were unaware. So, unable to see himself whether the demons were warring against him or leading him into sleep. He wants these holy men to watch with him and pray with him, whether or not he fell asleep. And it proves not to be the case, although he certainly felt sleepy, which I think would be true of anyone, going on so little. But sometimes I think anxiety can get the best of us in this regard. But I think one of the ideas being put forward here too is that demons at times will seek to make us sleepy at times of prayer, whether it's through suggestion or whatever it might be, or to be overly attentive to physical fatigue or pain or whatever it might be. And so he is keenly enough aware that that could be the possibility, that he wants 2 holy individuals to watch to see if he's being attacked in such a way, feeling himself sleepy at those times of prayer, especially later in the night. And so we have to be aware of that as well. It's natural at times that we should fall asleep in a relaxed state. But if it's happening every time we engage in prayer, we have to ask ourselves, is there something else going on here? And do I need to respond in such a way that I'm being more attentive to what's going on as I engage in prayer, my posture or whatever it might be, so that I'm not drifting off. This is why they didn't sit down or wouldn't allow themselves to lie down, because they knew it was a way of keeping themselves awake. The same elder related concerning Arsenius that he always stayed awake the entire night, and when in the morning he was compelled by necessity of nature to sleep a little while sitting, he would say to sleep, "Come here, you wicked servant." He would then sleep for a little while and immediately awaken. So, every once in a while they would realize, okay, I need a little bit to give myself a little bit in order to be able to function. Arsenius used to say that it is sufficient for a monk, if he is a struggler, to sleep for 1 hour. And, again, we have to keep in mind, the life that they led or the kind of labor that they were engaged into. And, those who live in the world and have certain tasks, might need more. But again, those who are being sustained by prayer, as well as engaging in this particular labor, are also going to be strengthened by it. So again, see it for what it is. Abba Bessarion said, I remained standing for 40 days and nights amid thorn bushes without sleeping in order to overcome sleep. So, thorn bushes. I know St. Francis did something similar to overcome lust, throwing himself into thorn bushes, I think, at one point. But again, we're getting close to this next hypothesis. So, hold it in mind. What we're seeing here is experimentation with all the appetites and needs of the body. And then we're going to come in the next hypothesis again to the sort of leveling off of that in accord with wisdom and restraint that is necessary. The same Abba Bessarion said, for 40 years, I have not lain on my side, but have slept sitting down or standing up. This elder passed his life like a bird of the air, without disturbance or anxiety. He acquired nothing on this earth, not even the slightest thing, neither books nor clothing, except for a single torn garment. He never went beneath a roof, but always abode in the open air, in desolate and uninhabited places where he struggled against the cold and the heat. In this way, he succeeded in transcending the needs of the body. It so happened that he once went into an inhabited region, and coming upon a certain monastery, sat outside the door and wept, as if he were a survivor of a shipwreck. When asked why he was weeping, he said, I am weeping for the wealth that I have lost and for the former glory and nobility from which I have miserably fallen. When he was invited to go inside the monastery and to eat with the monks, but could not be persuaded, they offered him bread, saying to him, take this bread for now, and whatever you have lost, God can restore to you again. As he took the bread, he sighed deeply and said, I do not know if I will be able to find what I lost, but I will not cease from seeking after it with all my strength. Thus did he finish his course. So what is the nobility that he lost in his mind? I think we are to ask in reading this. Is he really weeping over having lost the things of this world? Or is he weeping over having lost a greater nobility in Christ that he had at a certain point, at a time of greater zeal, where he didn't move and visit a monastery, but remained in the desert, in the open air? Was he constrained at some point physically to seek out need in the monastery, and so finds himself weeping over it? So this brings us to the end of the hypothesis. And so, as we prepare for next week, to hold it in mind, that what this is a preparation for. And again, this idea of the desert being a kind of laboratory and a place of seeking to restrain the flesh and the passions. And so often it does reach this level of extreme. Anthony writes, his weeping sounds like Da Vinci, who lamented not using God's gifts more, but like Cyrano de Bergerac, who struggled to maintain honor. Yeah, I think in some way that there was some virtue, some depth of prayer, or something within the spiritual life that had dissipated for one reason or another, that he did not maintain that course that he had been on. And but next week, I think we'll keep these in mind, that we'll be moving on to something that gives us a little bit more perspective for our own life. Okay. So thank you all, and won't we close with an Our Father and then go get our 1 hour sleep for the night? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Go in peace.